I began teaching literature, creative writing, and environmental studies here 4 years ago, I felt honored to be a part of a learning community that cares deeply about politics, ethics, aesthetics, and environmental implications of food production and consumption. I'm proud to say that my friend Janie Burns, who farms organic land in Nampa and is an eloquent spokeswoman of the Idaho local foods movement, is a graduate of the College of Idaho. The interdisciplinary course here, entitled Nature and Culture, required of all environmental studies majors and taught most recently by English professor Rochelle Johnson, biology professor Don Mansfield, and political economy professor Jim Swetnam, regularly focuses on food issues. In fact, those 3 faculty members are hoping to lead a study abroad trip to Italy with students to study the slow food movement, which we did there, which I could go. I have felt nothing but support for my own first-year seminar, Food for Thought, which I teach every year. My students read authors such as Michael Pollan, Eric Schlosser, Wendell Berry, David Masimoto, and Barbara Kingsolver, and we go on field trips to local farms. As part of the first-year program, every incoming freshman this year read a collection of essays by Wendell Berry entitled Bringing It to the Table on Farming and Food. And those of you who were at the dinner this evening heard from students Katie and Chalice, our 2 Sustainability Stewards. They maintain an organic garden on campus and have recently built a chicken coop, among their many other activities. Bon Appetit Dining Services not only feeds us local and often organic foods, but also regularly educates us about food sustainability. Therefore, in many ways, the College of Idaho is the perfect setting to celebrate and ponder Idaho's food this evening. And we thank you for lighting out to the west end of the valley to join us.
So, thanks. I'm delighted to be here among people who are really interested in celebrating local quality production of wonderful food. And if I had any suspicion of that your interest was only theoretical in Caldwell, that dinner would just, many of us just ate, put that to rest. There are clearly some serious eaters in this town. And it makes me feel very much at home. What I'd like to do in the next 20 minutes or so is to challenge you to think about food in a larger sense, beyond nutrition or entertainment, as a significant marker of who you are. So in a nutshell, what I want to do is talk about how, is to argue that in a significant way, you show your core values and your identity, how you define yourself, basically, every time you pick up a fork or look your glass to your lips. So this is about food as sort of self-disclosure. So before I get personal, I want to give you briefly 3 examples from Idaho history that I think beautifully suggest the connections between identity and what food scholars call food ways. And again, that's the idea of all the behaviors associated with selecting and procuring and preparing and consuming food. So my first test case concerns the historic food practices of 3 of northern Idaho's Indian tribes, the Nez Perce, the Coeur d'Alene, and the Kootenai. And this is all based on other people's research and my research, but this is a scholarly talk, thank heavens, so I'm not going to give any citations. If you're interested about where I've done any of this, I'll be happy to talk to you about it after this is done. So one thing that distinguishes these tribes' foodways is reverent attention to the natural world and its seasons. And I think that's reverence that almost borders on animism. In early spring, for example, prayers and physical rituals of Thanksgiving from all 3 tribes honored the literal rebirth of crops like biscuit root, wild potato, and a sequence of berries. Every scrap of food was preserved and eaten reverently, for to waste was not only to potentially squander nutrition, but also to insult the spirits that provided the berries, the fish, the ducks, and the deer. Beyond that sort of animism, food also helped these tribes affirm specific tribal identity in the way it was prepared. We tend to think, if we don't think very much about it, that all Indians ate pretty much the same. And that's completely nonsense. They didn't at all. Because their way of doing things, our way of preparing something, was as different among tribes as those people over theirs, as, say, an Italian's idea of what to do with an eggplant would differ from, say, Moroccans, right, or Chinese persons. So there were really careful ways that we eat it this way, and those barbarians, 6 miles away, needed some other another way. So it's very nuanced. For instance, the Nez Perce dried their berries and mixed them into cakes with camas and pemmican. So basically they dried them and saved them. Whereas the Kootenai liked to eat them sort of right away. This is the sort of potlatch thing. They took their berries and put them in a really moist pudding-like mixture of flour and water. And they flavored their pemmican, the dry stuff, with mint. They didn't want berry-flavored pemmican, yeah, right? They wanted mint-flavored pemmican. So there are these really careful distinctions among groups. Indian food practices also promoted social harmony. And I just want to give you one really quick example. There's been a lot of talk about Native Americans and their foodways lately that's kind of bordering on romantic and sompy and stereotypical. But this is real. I think it's really significant. This has to do with the way the Nez Perce gathered camas. I don't know if anybody but me in this room has ever eaten camas. It kind of tastes like tobacco, actually, when it's smoked. It's one of the most nutritious foods you can imagine. It's a root, and you've probably seen camas flowers, those beautiful blue flowers that grow in wet meadows, especially in northern Idaho. And so it turns out that the roots are incredibly nutritious. And that was one of the staples of life for Nez Perce in the winter. And so it was essential that everybody be able to gather enough camas to sustain themselves, and that people not hoard and not compete, because obviously that's going to tear a tribe apart, a small band apart that way. So tradition dictated that everybody wait until a man skilled at reading the plant's readiness for harvest declared publicly that harvest time had come. Everybody kind of waited in the village, said, "Is it ready yet? Is it ready yet?" And I love that particular expert was called a peace chief. Not a camas chief, but a peace chief, which suggests something about how they knew that this was a way of regulating themselves so they didn't compete with each other. Then everybody started to gather on the same day for the traditional camas grounds of that band. Once there, every family in turn had its own historically assigned plot. So everything is laid out ahead of time. There's no sort of, cut the ribbon and the homesteaders all rush and elbow each other out of the way. It's very, very regulated and very, very careful. To encroach on another spot was considered reprehensible, and Nez Perce told ethnographer Frye. This sense of fairness has persisted in modern times. Frye was also told of a group of women in the 1960s who set up teepees on camas grounds that had historically belonged to an elderly woman. She was old, but she was too infirm to go to the camas grounds. She didn't really need camas to live. She had access to modern food on the reservation. She wasn't poverty-stricken, but bystanders were so appalled at these women going on to this other woman's camas growing area that they basically pressured, elbowed, the story goes, these women off the woman's patch, and nobody gathered there that year. It's a moral sin to take somebody else's camas ground. Methods of preparing the camas after it was gathered also underline mutual interdependence, that's an easy word. They basically dug communal pits, digging a pit to smoke camas, which is how you preserve it one way. It's a lot of work, so there was one tribal pit. Everybody had a sack with essentially their family's name on it. They put in, all the women stoked the fire collectively. The men, by the way, were playing games at the time. The men had other responsibilities, but camas was women's work. Camas smoking was women's work. Deer harvest, duck harvest, fish harvests were similarly coordinated and regulated among all three tribes. There was a duck chief and a deer chief and a salmon chief in these, so people were in charge of these things. So food-related behaviors among Native Americans solidified, you might say, tribal identity, not only between tribes, but also within a tribe, helping people get a sense of working together for common purpose and paying attention to the natural world. Now, Idaho's early miners, which is the second group I want to mention briefly, represented something like the polar opposite. These men were preoccupied with striking a bridge, and they planned to move on when that happened, so they were completely oblivious to seasonal patterns and particular resources, and unconcerned with cooperation. Eating locally was a term that would never have occurred to them. As architecting and plaster work, and they were tied to the immediate area around their mines. So they hunted and fished those out really fast. And so there wasn't local food available. So they didn't hunt or fish. Who's going to take a day off and fish? I might strike it rich today. That's the prevailing mindset. Nor did they show any interest in local berries, greens, or roots, or any fresh vegetables for that matter. One woman in central Idaho who attempted to grow vegetables for sale on camp reported bitterly that there was little call for her wares. They preferred tinned goods, so easy, she complained in her memoir. Even miners who struck it rich, right? You think once you have a little bit of money, you're going to eat better. Well, you eat more expensively, but not necessarily better. What these people indulged in was conspicuous consumption feasts in hotels. And there are a lot of real fascinating menus from mining camp hotels, which talk about marketop on the plate. Essentially, what these people ate when they struck it rich were feasts of fatty beefsteak, cream puddings, lots of cream puddings, tinned consomme, and the pièce de la résistance, oysters brought over land from Portland, in which had to be very iffy. No sense of aesthetics or health concerns regulated what happened to all those cans either. One mining community saw a heap of empty, unrinsed cans a dozen feet high grow at its edge, an eyesore that drew flies and varmints that were a danger to public health. Another danger to public health at mining camps was the need to use every scrap of food. These were typically a long way from anywhere that produced food and very narrow canyons. So every bit of food had to be used. So typically butter and pork fat that had gone rancid were eaten, and flour infected with bugs. Obviously, this was choked out with a lot of whiskey. And when we read about what miners ate in reminiscences, you have to realize what all that whiskey was for. It wasn't necessarily for intoxication, but sort of digestive purposes. Dawswell miners certainly ate very differently than Indians. Their food was also defined them as men so edgy, so consumed by a desire for profit that they were willing to forego both their health and one of the most basic human pleasures in service. Idaho's homesteaders and early farmers and ranchers occupied a kind of middle ground. Like Native Americans, they tended to be more sensitive to land. Obviously, they were committed to staying for the long term, so they hunted and fished, and they learned to forage wild foods. But it would be a mistake to romanticize them as adapting willingly in all ways, because just like the miners, they brought a previous cultural set of conditioned taste in food, and there were lines they just would not cross. They did use indigenous foodstuffs, for instance, but they tended to process the dickens out of them, using them in familiar recipes rather than using them as what we call today whole foods. One woman who lived in Troy, Idaho, up north, rejected the Indian custom of munching on vitamin C-rich raw rose hips, for instance. Instead, she put a bunch of sugar in it. Like, is this a strange food? What do? You should put a lot of sugar in it. A lot of sugar in it, and cooked them down to a jelly so concentrated and sugary, it, quote, tasted like wild honey. So the rose hips were sort of submerged in this. Along the same lines, if you look, there's a wonderful Idaho Historical Society cookbook of pioneer recipes. And it sounds like a lovely thing. When you start looking at the recipes, they're kind of appalling. People took perfectly good deer and smoked it in kielbasa. People took perfectly good rabbit and ground it up with a lot of pork fat and made pasties in the Cornish sense. People simmered browns to death and potted it, covered with fat in the English manner. And I'd say this is just personal, and I hope I'm not offending anybody, but to me, this is sort of they're sort of the forerunners of that contemporary impulse that when you get an elk, rather than eating it in some delicious way that says elk, you put it in elk chili, or worse, you make it into jerky, which could be made out of anything, or you make it familiar rather than tasting it like itself. Even given that, there were some foods that they wouldn't even touch. And this, I think, my granddaughter when she was 9. Now she's a serious foodie. She used to have this phrase, the weird food, which is something you really don't want to eat. And so some food were just weird to these people. Even during hungry winters, a nasty mess, one reminiscence calls camas bread, that's sacred of men themselves on incredibly laborious canning marathons, hundreds and hundreds of jars. When those jars were empty, they put something else in the jars. Today we think about canning like something you do in late August. No, they can all year long. As soon as a jar was empty, if they had anything they could put in it, they put it in it. And they used incredibly humble ingredients. One memoirist from Bonner County, again up north, reports as a child her favorite dessert was carrot pie. And carrot, we should do this for the 12. It was carrot pie. And carrot preserves were the best jam she ever tasted. A beloved staple, son of a gun in a sack, or depending on how frank your family was often called son of a bitch in a sack, because of its taste. Blended lard, flour, dried fruit, and sugar, and was steamed until it achieved a pudding-like consistency that anything they probably would recognize. All kinds of pieces of meat that we wouldn't eat today were eaten. The writer Annie Greenwood, who lived in around Twin Falls, on one of those irrigation projects, was appalled her first night when she came as a new bride to her new home. One of her neighbors gave her a fancy dinner. She couldn't figure out what she was eating because it was clearly pork, but it was really homely. And it's a wonderful moment in the sagebrush folks. She says, then I realized that my dinner had been a mother. It was salad with nursing appendages. Okay, so all kinds of strange parts of animals were eaten. Vinegar pie supplanted carrot pie as winter stretched on. Rutabaga loaves supplanted salad. But the interesting thing is that people remember those subsistence meals very, very fondly as badges of character, not as slogans of shame. The slogan, necessity is the mother of invention, could very well have originated with a heroic pioneer woman, one writer remembers. And Mama loved us very well. She showed that by letting us never go hungry, even out in the wilderness, writes about it. That wilderness, by the way, was a perfectly lit irrigation tract, federally developed land. Right? So there's such a wilderness is a little bit different than ours. So all this suggests just how culturally conditioned food choices are, I hope. How associated with distinctive cultural norms and sense of personal identity. While the pioneer woman I mentioned a minute ago raised her nose in disgust at Camus, and then as personal might very well have done the same about vinegar pie. A flush miner would have pitied the farm family sitting down to rutabaga loaf. The wife of that family would have put down certainly the healthfulness of the oysters he ate and their expense. A Kootenai would have wondered why the miner wasn't eating spring sturgeon from local waters and breathes from their backs. It's all really relevant and all very revealing of who these people are. And so I challenge you, the last couple of minutes here are personal, to think about what your own food practices say about your essential values, your essential evolving sense of who you are. You might, for instance, think about the kinds of food you prefer to eat and how you procure it. Are you so committed to organic and local foods, for instance, that you'd go for an anemic local carrot, organic, of course, at the farmers, at the co-op, and eat it, even though it's kind of wilty and weird. And I know nobody in this room ever grows wilty, weird, organic carrots, but just imagine that for a second. Or would you buy one of those beautiful purple and red core carrots Albertsons sometimes brings in from conventional farms in Oregon? Or do you support Albertsons altogether? Have you ever been inside a Costco? Costco raises a really interesting crop. It's not local, right? So local borders don't go there. But a lot of the stuff is organic and with impeccable credentials, which puts you on some kind of a weird ethical bind there. Are you willing, as I am, to get up really early on Saturdays so you can get to the very finest stuff in the farmer's market? And I've talked to a couple of people here about a friend of mine who always goes early with me. And we're the two people who always want the same weird vegetables, Eliza and I. And so we're always at the stand together and looking at each other and thinking, okay, who's going to get it? So we worked out this little dynamic where we're there at the same time. We split it down the middle, right? The black crayons or the whatever. But if we're not on time, we're allowed to buy all of it so that it doesn't fall into the hands of infidels. We never talked about this, but this is clearly what the two of Saturday ritual, and it's really sad to be that obsessed about food that you'd actually go to the farmer's market and buy all the black currant tomatoes, right? What that says a lot about you and who you are and what you value. Are you willing, here's another one, are you willing to pay more for a food item if it's special in some way? And I bet a lot of you are, like me. But let me remind you that in some cultures, economy is a badge of honor. One scholar, one really nifty study, is of a small Greek island, where the scholar discovered that being able to say you've got food as cheaply as possible is a major marker of intelligence and status. So on that island, people who are perceived as paying too much are scorned and pitied for being used, basically. Much as any Wearmark shopper might pity, right, or an organic snob like me, right? So it's just because it's more expensive and better doesn't necessarily make you smarter in some cultures. You also might consider what your food choices say about how far you've fallen or not from your ancestral tree. Do you cook exactly like your parents? And I'm not just talking about ethnic here. I'm talking about, that's the obvious one, right? You still make what your mother made. But this is different. What I'm talking about is what has to do with sort of tasting food. I know I don't cook like my mother with a vengeance. My mother was a 1950 Betty's Prime. The kind who believed that a can of cream of something soup never hurt anything, except for baby chocolate. But not me. Since I left home in 1968, I have never made her mushroom hot roast, the crown of creation, although she sends me the recipe every year. And I can count on one hand the number of dishes of Jell-O with canned fruit cocktail. These are the staples of our life. Potato chips were a food group, of course. She was the kind of frugal 1950s housewife who prided herself in searching out discounted day-old loaves of bread and bags of potato chips whose sell-by dates loomed. A week ago, this is a true story, I unapologetically spent $100 on the dinner party before. And I made the bread myself from scratch that morning from one of Carol Hill's recipes, an Italian baker. If you don't know any baking, you must know that. It's wonderful. But I had to run all over town to buy semolina, to find semolina flour, which was like 80,000 times more expensive than regular flour. So clearly I put some cultural distance between myself and my mother. And of course, food is just the tip of the iceberg, but we're not going to go there. Yet I ritualistically make many of my Pennsylvania German grandmother's dishes, not just at holidays, but regularly in their appointed seasons. I'm really, tomorrow, as soon as I get home, since it's finally October, I'm allowed to make choux pie. I'm so excited. Tomorrow is choux pie. I can make choux pie in October and November, and that's it. That's what my grandmother made. And I'm just so excited about that. And it's not the horrible wet pie kind. It's the cakey kind. For those of you who know your choux pie. That's my Pennsylvania Dutch tradition. A food scholar looking at me might conclude rightly that I'm being selectively nostalgic in my search for self-definition, rejecting the suburban culture I grew up in to embrace what I perceive to be more authentic roots. But I am a scholar and I am committed to full disclosure. So I have to admit that I know I'm constructing a partial portrait of my sainted grandmother to identify with. She was an incredible scratch cook and maintained a huge garden with my grandfather. But she too served as canned fruit cocktail. In her case, it was a special treat before Easter dinner, and these amazing little cut glass, little mage glasses. And the juxtaposition was completely bizarre. It says a lot about her. Right? These priceless glasses with canned fruit cocktail. So strange. She bought her pastries from Entenmann's, and if she found out how much I had spent on that dinner party, she'd be spending like a top. Because economy was a big one for her. In the end, this is all about symbolism and all about very culturally bound self-definition. I'd encourage you, if you think this is at all interesting, to think for the next couple of days or weeks about what further food choices say about you. What kind of food do you serve at particular occasions or holidays, and why? Do you tend to serve junkier food than you myself to believe that if I leave any green tomatoes on my plants, superstitiously, next year I'm not going to get any tomatoes. You bring them all in somehow. So that has to happen tomorrow too. Do you fish and hunt? Are there rituals associated with those things? Who hunts? Where? Is it a family bonding thing? Do you go by yourself? How do you do that? What do you do with the meat you get? Are you one of those elk chili and elk jerky people who are looking at me funny? Or do you, as I do, when somebody gives me a piece of elk, gussy it up with fresh cranberries and horseradish? It's delicious. It's really sweet. It's yummy. Do you gather wild berries? If so, do you frugally freeze them and maybe serve a dish, say, ritualistically on New Year's Day, out of respect for huckleberry gods? Or do you sit around the kitchen table and scarf them all down and a big potlatch? That makes my blood run cold. It says something more about me than about anything else. Would you be shamed if you brought a Fred Meyer's potato salad to a potluck? Store-made Christmas cookies to a school party? Admittedly, it's easy to be shocked at people whose responses to such questions differ from yours. I know I would rather not go to a potluck than bring a Fred Meyer potato. Still, I urge you instead to undertake such an examination of conscience in the spirit of self-understanding. Because I bet you'll learn a lot about yourself in what you discover. For food, perhaps more than any other aspect of our behavior, provides daily and inescapable evidence of how we construct our identities as individuals, as contemporary Idahoans, you might say, just as surely as those Indians and miners and homesteaders did. Or to put it more simply, as the early 19th century writer and film Virat Savaran once wrote, "Tell me what you eat, and I'll tell you who you are."
All right. Oh, well, I have a couple of icebreakers. By definition, a locavore is someone who eats locally grown foods. B, someone who eats trains. C, someone who eats crazy Spanish speakers. Go away. Or D, someone you would want to share a porta-john with. I don't know camping. I don't know. Here's another question. How many locavores does it take to stand together on an issue? 6, but they can only leave one footprint. You might want to move back.
That's green humor for you. I like that. I'm going here. Let me trade you. My script ended up over here.
Oh my gosh.
Wow, how's that working out for you?
Check. I'll just stand right here.
All right. And we have water too. Remember we were going to move, hide.
Oh, that's right.
We were going to hide so that more people could see the slides.
Can you see the slides?
Okay, good. Well, good evening. Good evening, locavores and foodies in general. It's great to be here celebrating the Year of Idaho Food. My name is Joe Goldman.
And I am Tom Wilmorth. Some of you may know us as the Fool Squad. Tonight we serve as the Food Squad.
That's right, but many of you probably do not know that Tom and I are very involved in the local food movement. In fact, we started a local organization to bring small natural farmers together. Sounds like we're talking about little people. Small natural farmers. I'm of course referring to the we're involved in the Council of Organic Wellness Partnership in Idaho, otherwise known as CowPie.
At CowPie, we advise small farmers about organic growing before they jump in with both feet.
That's right. And if somebody cuts corners or breaks the rules of organic growers code, well, CowPie raises one mighty stink.
Well, we're pleased that this is the Year of Idaho Food. We know there were several other choices that the State Office of Years of could have tried.
That's right.
Getting a designation in the Years of... they beat out this kind of thing. The Year of Idaho Cleanse.
That was a very successful one.
The Year of Idaho Wastewater and Sewage.
Everybody attend that one?
The parade, not so much.
I know, and actually, if we want to disclose full truthfulness, we were actually involved in that one too. If you go see the Idaho wastewater display, watershed. We're there at the poo factory.
The Year of Idaho Soars and Infectious Diseases.
Someone did not have as good an attendance.
And the Year of Idaho Disgraced Pictures. Now an annual event. Here comes nothing. You don't jackknife your boat in my yard, I won't jackknife your boat in your yard.
That's right. Now, it's an honor to have been asked here tonight in such distinguished company. We enjoyed Dr. Swetnam's lecture. However, we would like to take a broader look at history of local farming, and it starts with this gentleman, Neanderthal horticulturalis, who lived 130,000 years ago in Middleton, Idaho. But something happened that seemingly, to the seemingly contented, thick-browed agricultural brute. You still looking at the slide?
Well, we could share with you a well-developed hypothesis with scientific models and maybe a diorama.
We could do that.
But that would take research, and let's be honest, making this stuff up is a whole lot faster.
Your students know what I'm talking about.
There are some theories that cowpies like to throw against the wall and see what sticks.
That's right. So the question we asked ourselves is, why did early man move away from a local homegrown diet, organically grown foods? And we have two main theories that we'd like to examine in this. Theory number one, primal urge for instant gratification was difficult to control. There's an actual cave painting that we found. Maybe somewhere in Frye.
Gotta get that Ryrie joke in there.
No,
but more credible is theory number two.
That's right. Theory number two. Once early man landed the hot cave girl, he simply just let himself go. And we've got several pieces of evidence to support this theory. First, caveman starts to think more about work, promotion, and advancement. Everyone is way too familiar with this image, apparently, to go, well, they really figured that out. His diet changes for the worse, and also the diet can also bring down the entire clan with him, as seen in the Brontosaurus rib episode from Flintstones number 424. This led to a dangerous trend for generations, pretty much reading from the Bronze Age up through the, what we believe is the nickel-plated age.
Really, paleontologists in the audience?
Any paleontologists?
No? Good. Perfect.
We're all right. Nickel-plated age. Look it up. All right, and now I'm going to have to go all medieval on your ass. The medieval ass was very helpful to the farmer. Otherwise, this poor dope was just out all night sowing seeds, especially apparently working underneath a very early Van Gogh painting. Van Gogh. We're educators, we can say Van Gogh. Medieval farms revived the small town feel of the community farm once again. Also, evidence indicates that the plots were very small and the work was evenly divided. I don't know if you can see this very well, but everybody's working very hard except for this joker in the middle who seems to be cooking Jiffy Pop over a primitive child's wagon.
Since we don't have all night, we'd like to skip ahead to more modern times, and frankly, this period bores the hell out of me. So I usually skip it in theater history class and tell the students that the plague wiped out everybody, especially actors, in that theater for hundreds of years.
They're not gonna know. Then it picks up with Shakespeare.
There we go.
So now we'd like to move on to farming in the USA. Farming in the USA. So as Toby Keith likes to say, you know, farm it or leave it. He knows that the USA or the highway is the thing that works around here. Shoot, the USA might as well have invented farming. We perfected it. High productivity. That's right. Innovation. There it is. Look at that. Modern creation. And of course, we figured out the whole free labor thing pretty quickly.
I can hear you all pucker. That's the sound of it.
That's right. And of course, we safely solved the problems of weeds and bugs. Safely. That's right. Farming became something you could almost do from the comfort of your own living room. Those of you guilty of playing this online game are now squirming in your seats. The industrial farm was born.
But something unexpected happened. Rumors began spreading that perhaps some of the practices of mega farms were harmful.
No.
Who could have guessed that flooding the plants with industrial chemicals might carry some risks?
Well, you could have knocked me over with a feather. Growing up, my family had a little shaker of potassium chloride that we'd sprinkle on our cereal in the morning.
Many people
Look it up.
found it quaint. Some found it quaint that these chemicals can either fertilize your crops or make a high explosive to level an entire building.
That was quaint. Quaint is the word I would use.
Quaint is the word.
But concern gripped the general public when they started to see strange results from the chemically altered food. Who knew that a little bit of this would lead to a little bit of this? I wish I could say that I got to Photoshop this guy in a Chernobyl suit filling some farm implement with deadly chemical, but I didn't. It's actually right there. It's on the phone.
And a little bit of this makes a little bit of this.
And of course, a little bit of this makes a little bit of this.
And a little bit of this.
That's not so bad. All right. But it really wasn't until some unavoidable consequences of industrial farming came to light and started crushing entire cities underfoot that our nation's leaders stepped in. Peruse this newspaper clipping we found online. David Farmer said he's been eating chemical treated bloodstream.
But the wheels of change. Turn slowly. Especially when wads of cash get stuck in the gears. And we started hearing phrases like bumper crop and supersized chicken sandwich.
And really, it wasn't all bad, because when one carrot cube can feed an entire destroyer crew and be used as a military deterrent, yeah, something. But ultimately, the evidence of harm being done is hard to ignore, as seen in the subjects of these secret government files that we recently uncovered via WikiLeaks. So the actual subjects. I know, and the most worrisome fact is that these abnormalities could get unwittingly passed along to future generations. Well, even in Idaho.
Strong lobbying of government officials make it too difficult to completely do away with these harmful practices. But, ladies and gentlemen,
You can see the lobbying going on right there, our very own.
Which one's the
He's the one on the left, with a nice haircut.
Oh, the one nice. He's very appealing.
Wow, you got a grown up. Good job, Tom.
To celebrate Idaho by going back to the future?
Yes, let's go back to the future.
Back to the future.
Back to a time when hay didn't have to be baled into nicely formed rectangles, but you could just rake it into seemingly giant hairball-shaped tick creatures in the middle of the field.
When family farms grew crops and children by the wagonful.
That's right. When chickens were allowed to roam the range freely. I mean, really free. I mean, we're talking roam here.
Let's make our farms a safe, friendly place where people can once again visit. Sometimes from great distances.
We're on board. That's all right. It's after the chicken thing.
Well, if they're going great distances, it's a good thing they're doing it in your Prius.
You don't know how hard that shot was to shoot. We want to go back to a time where people felt close to their food source. There's the picture. Of course, we don't want them to feel too close to their food source. Where livestock was well cared for. There he is. And their hair was allowed to grow long until women dressed in colonial garb came along and milked them. What is that? Please, somebody tell me. I don't know what that is, but that woman is milking it. It doesn't look like it's used to having that happen to it.
You're agricultural enthusiasts. Look.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Locavore movement, we are proud to be one of you. Actually, I guess technically we're two of you. And tonight, we salute your grassroots, not-for-profit, eco-friendly, abstinence-based society dedicated to restoring the simple life that comes with living in the Treasure Valley.
Say, can we have a show of hands? How many of you were actually born right here in the Treasure Valley? Anybody here was born? Thank you, thank you. Yes, the ones in the bib overalls and the John Deere. Excellent. Well, I myself, it's actually true, was born in Caldwell. Right here. The county seat that always puts down the lid. Now this is before Caldwell became a booming metropolis of literally hundreds of people.
That's right. Now when I moved here from St. Louis in the 90s, the Treasure Valley was great. And then all these out-of-state carpet-bagging Johnny-come-latelys barged in here and ruined it for the rest of us. By the way, the definition of outsider is anybody that moved here after you did.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are talking, of course, about Californication.
We're talking about Oregonization,
Washington festation,
Utah pluralization,
and a general flood of, heaven forbid, red state neocon immigration. If that applies to any of you, thank you for the tax base. But you have upheaved the cultural way of life here in the Treasure Valley.
and that's the Treasure Valley.
Treasure Valley, you got that right. Now, you can call me crazy.
Crazy!
You can't call me crazy. Crazy. But I recall a valley when alive after 5 was an oxymoron.
You call me crazy.
You're crazy.
But I recall a time when you could wash your car in Indian Creek and not over the top of it. Just saying.
And you can call me crazy.
Crazy.
But I recall when you could have a good-natured advertisement for the Rocky Mountain oyster feed and people wouldn't get all testy. Oh, they got testy.
I mean, I thought it was funny. I'm no Mallard Fillmore, but I think I know funny when I see it.
Maybe I'm crazy, ladies and gentlemen, but I think singing an old traditional can transform hearts and minds. So let's join in song and recollect the way the Treasure Valley once was. Josephus, will strike up the bangs.
Sorry, there's a reason my ukulele is not in front of a microphone. I'm no hokum high flyer, ladies and gentlemen. I'll leave that to the professionals.
That's Hawaiian.
I know.
Oh, that's you.
Everything sounds Hawaiian.
It's like the whole Treasure Valley.
All right, here you go. You start in. I'll accompany you.
Okay.
Oh, they kept me.
But let me start again. All right, because I'm coming in on a pitch.
Right.
And you're going to be right there with that pitch. Oh, okay.
Oh,
They'll tempt you to the future. It's the Red River Valley. How does that go, man?
they'll tempt you
to the future. Thank you, Joe. Tell you progress is pride, growth is good. But remember the old Treasure Valley. I'd go back there to live if I could.
Every morning the freeways were empty. On-street parking was ample and free. So who cares if the storefronts were shuttered? We bought our formal wear at D&B.
There was no growth in Nampa or Caldwell. Cuna was a one-lane overpass. Back then, Boise made a punchline of Meridian. Now they're big enough to come and kick our
How we rooted for Boise Junior College when tuition was 15 bucks a class. And the turf wasn't blue, it was yellow. The U of I I served up credits by the glass. Well, it's nice to know something, Coach Age.
Local foods in my day were all natural. You could pick a perfect apple off a tree, and you never found a worm in any orchard, thanks to a liberal dose of DDT. No dairy cow required shots of hormones when taken to the Canyon County Fair. I still recall that sweet bovine aroma. Just take a whiff of Nampa's dairy air. Say a mega farm makes food cheaper. You can say that. You can say that local food's a pain to grow. Just remember the old Treasure Valley and the way that we farmed not long ago. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
I've been asked to say just a few words for a couple minutes about the challenges facing the local foods movement here in Idaho. And I should, by the way, thank my wife, Megan Dixon, for having a conversation with me over pizza a couple nights ago, and a lot of these ideas emerged out of that conversation. So, the problem I want to focus on briefly is the problem of image. My training in literature encourages me to pay attention to the way images produce meaning and rhetorically shape the responses of readers. Usually I ponder the significance of images or metaphors in poetry or prose, but the food movement also has an image in public consciousness. And I use food movement in this talk as an umbrella term that includes the local, organic, and artisanal or slow food movements. What is this image of the food movement? And what does the food movement mean to the average American? Those in the food movement are thought of, it turns out, partly accurately, though not entirely, as members of the urban elite. Those who drive their Priuses while sipping their caramelized lattes, of course, to the Whole Foods markets or co-ops on their way home from yoga class. And while there's nothing wrong with any of these things or activities, indeed I myself enjoy lattes and yoga occasionally, the composite image or stereotype associated with the food movement often suggests a privileged white-collar class, the niche market that can afford to eat sustainably. Especially during these hard economic times, when ukulele sales go up. Apparently that's true during recessions, and especially ukulele sales always go up.
I have mine.
It's out there, it's gold stuff. This image does not serve the political and environmental goals of the food movement, goals that include shifting our nation's food system away from its profoundly damaging industrialized excesses and towards smaller scale, sustainable, and local food networks. Of course, this shift necessitates top-down changes in governmental legislation and regulation. For instance, ending federal subsidies that enable the overproduction of monoculture commodity corn and other agribusiness practices that damage the environment and our health. But this shift also requires bottom-up changes in consumer behavior. If the food movement is to endure, grow, and make any lasting difference in terms of affecting consumers, then it needs to address the cultural problem of seeming class hierarchy that is the result of its image in public consciousness. This is particularly true in light of the food movement's emphasis on artisanal quality and culinary sophistication. Both wonderful things, of course, but as Tom Philpott warns, quote, if the food movement becomes dominated by its white tablecloth faction, and he's thinking of Alice Waters and her disciples like Chip Pennies in San Francisco, it risks devolving into a high-end tasting club that has little impact on the broader culture. Part of the cultural dilemma I am outlining here involves the tendency, especially these days, among the working class to resent the sometimes accurately perceived condescension of urban elites. Those in the food movement need, therefore, to think creatively about ways to reach out genuinely, not just strategically, across conventional cultural and political divides. One way to do this is to emphasize, instead of the white tablecloth, the ways our industrialized food system comes at a great social cost to rural America. The centralization of food processors and meatpacking plants, the get big or get out agricultural policies that have dominated our nation since the middle of the 20th century. The Monsanto's seed patent bullying, for instance, do nothing but harm individual farmers and ranchers and the communities they live in. Another way to address the food movement's elitist image is to reinforce what Wendell Berry argues, that is to raise the status of the farmer in American thought. Too often ridiculed still with cultural stereotypes, redneck, country bumpkin, hillbilly. The American farmer needs to be re-seen as the astute steward of the land, as so many are, especially the ones in this room. This is a powerful way the arts, literature, film, music, television, can contribute to the reformation of American thought. The critics of Wendell Berry dismiss him as a romantic Luddite, an old-fashioned reactionary opposed to progress of the capital heaping, naively behind the times. But anyone who actually reads Berry and takes him seriously understands that his position is not only entirely traditional in the best sense of the word, but simultaneously radical and sophisticated in our age of industrialized agriculture. At the heart of his traditionally radical or radically traditional writings is the rock-steady belief that the farmer's relationship with the land is fundamentally ecological, that the farmer, if he or she is to farm well, will never stop growing and understanding the land and its needs, not just productivity and other human needs. Indeed, in this vision, the needs of humans and the needs of nature intertwine. Instead of behind the times, Berry's ecological farmer is entirely timeless. Or if you're going to live in a reality that includes the earth, then ecological knowledge is always contemporary and ongoing, especially pressing today. To counteract the elitist associations the food movement carries with it at times, food movement could do more, therefore, to foreground their producers, that is, the ecological farmers, who are, after all, people who work very, very hard. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your Year of Idaho Food. Thanks so much for being here this evening.